Opioid addiction is a national public health crisis that affects individuals and families regardless of their age, race, or income. The statistics are overwhelming. More than 130 people die from opioid addiction every day. But there is hope. Recovery is possible. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not replace advice from a medical provider when making healthcare decisions. This podcast contains opinionated content and may not reflect the opinions of any organizations this podcast is affiliated with. We will discuss opioid use, opioid treatment, and physical and psychological trauma, which may be triggering for some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. In Season 2, we'll be focusing on the next generation of young people facing the opioid crisis. And today, on Someone You Know, we're joined by Tim Rabolt, the Executive Director for the Association of Recovery in Higher Education, and Keith Murphy, Substance Abuse Specialist and Recovery Counselor at Rutgers University. On this episode, we focus on the next generation of young people facing the opioid crisis, including the best practices for launching a successful collegiate recovery program. We also discuss the role stigma plays for the younger generation, why the students need to be at the center of all collegiate recovery programs, and how Tim and Keith are leading their respective programs to stay connected during the COVID-19 crisis. I'm your host, Heather Major, and this is Someone You Know. Thanks so much to Tim and Keith for joining the Independence Blue Cross Foundation as we embark upon our second season of our Someone You Know podcast. It's great to have you both here virtually with us today. We had a great first season of Someone You Know, and we really covered a broad swath of topics last year. And we're excited because we had great listenership. A lot of people were tuning in internationally and domestically. And this season, we're going to be a little more focused with our conversations, and that's really why both of you are here today. We're focusing on the next generation of young people who are facing the opioid crisis, a generation that's truly been shaped by addiction. And we're talking about something specific today that I think will really be of interest to many, many people, parents, caregivers, family members, students themselves. We're going to talk about recovery communities on college campuses and what that means. And I'm really excited to have you both join us today, Tim Rabolt and Keith Murphy, who specialize in this area. They know more about this than most people that we get to talk to, and excited for them to share some of their knowledge with all of us, myself included. Tim, if you don't mind, can we talk a little bit about, can you tell us a little bit about your journey and why this organization is important to you?
My name is Tim Rabolt. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the Executive Director for the Association of Recovery in Higher Education, ARHE. And so what ARHE does, we're a nonprofit membership association that represents approximately 150 colleges and universities that have support services on campus for students in recovery from addiction. And these services are known as Collegiate Recovery Programs, or CRPs. I actually got into recovery in high school, believe it or not. So I went to school and grew up in Wilmington, Delaware, so not far from you all in the Philadelphia area. And, you know, on paper, I mean, it was a pretty, I guess, surface level, great upbringing in childhood. Like, there really wasn't anything wrong externally, but, you know, I went through some stuff, and that trauma ended up kind of manifesting itself in addiction. And, you know, by the middle of senior year, it was a full-blown substance use disorder, and I was extremely privileged, you know, just based on, you know, my own characteristics and how the systems are kind of set up to receive treatment and recovery support. And, you know, I was just really fortunate to find recovery at an early age, and went down to Washington, D.C. for college at the George Washington University, and really thought I was going to meet all these students in recovery that were just there waiting for me, and it didn't really happen like that. But what ended up happening was eventually, you know, after meeting some other students and administrators, we got this student organization put together on campus, and that was called Students for Recovery. And we had our first meeting a little over 8 years ago in February of 2012. And that student organization kind of developed and grew. And, you know, by the time I was going into my senior year, I heard about a Collegiate Recovery Conference. And I didn't really know that other schools had the same type of service or these communities. And so when I heard about programs like Rutgers and Ohio State and Texas Tech, I was just blown away. And I went to this conference, and it was almost, it felt for me like a midlife crisis, because I was studying something completely different. And I came back from that conference and decided I wanted to just pour all of my energy into this because I was so fortunate, having achieved recovery and sustained recovery for almost a decade now, and to see so many individuals who didn't get that shot or who didn't have the system set up to support them the same way and wanting to make a difference. And I knew I would never be as good of maybe like a counselor, like someone like Keith. Like I wouldn't be really good working in an actual program. So I wanted to do it more on the national level. And ARHE seemed like a good fit. And I joined as a member after that conference. And then they just couldn't get rid of me. And so now I'm the executive director. And it's been one of the greatest gifts of my entire life.
That's great. You have staying power. That's what that's called. So Keith, you are a recovery counselor at Rutgers. Can you give us a little more? Can you tell us why Rutgers and why counseling?
Okay. Well, first, shout out to Tim. He's somebody that I'm super always impressed with, and just being able to witness some of his journey and just what he took and did with so far with ARHE and what he did at George Washington was amazing to see. I'm the Northeast representative or regional representative for the Association of Recovery in Higher Education. I also work as a recovery counselor at Rutgers University. Technically, my title is substance abuse specialist because really there is no language of recovery on any college campus. It's really hard for people to really wrap their minds around the construct that recovery does happen. More often than not, there's so much energy and resources focused on prevention and then some type of intervention and ongoing treatment to help students change their relationship with substances that they don't think about the other end of the continuum as it wraps around in terms of recovery. So if you look for my position on the Rutgers campus or anywhere in job descriptions through HR, you won't see recovery counselor. That was the position that my boss dreamed up because she knew that students needed additional support. And again, I got to give a shout out to my predecessor, Frank Greenagel, who was able to really put the position on the map and really help make it what it is in terms of just like supporting students' activities and doing a whole bunch of other stuff and then making connections, because there was really no roadmap for this before, because people don't think about recovery. They just think about students who are actively using or not. They don't think about students who need additional support or students who are really, really healing from brain trauma in terms of, dealing with academics, dealing with family life, working out financial stuff, learning how to socialize, learning how to have fun. So it's how to eat, how to have relationships, how to have romantic relationships. So it goes on and on and on, because we recognize that, in terms of addiction, there's no area that goes untouched. A lot of students are also dealing with trauma as a result of addiction or prior to, and they need additional support. The trouble is that oftentimes students in recovery are pathologized in terms of looking at them as defective or being problematic, as opposed to being an asset on college campuses. So all of that is tied into my title as recovery counselor, because I don't help students become special substance abusers. It's really a ridiculous title when you think about it. But I'm all about language. But if I were to go out with that kind of a title to try and meet students, no one would want to come see me. Like, that's not my life. So the emphasis has to be on strengths and the change and the transformation, which is recovery.
One of the things that we wanted to talk very specifically about both of you today, given that you both understand the southeastern region of Pennsylvania very well. We wanted to talk to you about this area being known as meds and eds, right? This is where you can find world-class medical care and where you can find world-class education. It's an area with more than 100 colleges and universities, except in at least our limited findings, very few schools actually operate formal collegiate recovery programs or recovery communities. Curious for your thoughts as to what might be hindering more of a widespread adoption to this, given just the density of the area that we're in, of schools and institutions, and just how many people come to school in southeastern Pennsylvania. Any thoughts on progress or the hindrance of progress to a more widespread adoption in our region?
Yeah, I just have some quick initial thoughts, because we get a question similar to this a lot of times around what's stopping this state, what's stopping this region, what's holding it back. And if you look at where the clusters of programs are, if you look at Virginia, West Virginia, North Carolina, you might think that all three of them are kind of, in the same region. Or you look at Texas or California, usually there's some catalyst for what prompted that state to, have a disproportionate amount of collegiate recovery programs. So there's not really a ranking that we, come up with, but for collegiate recovery programs, it's different. Just like there's different paths for every individual that's in recovery. Texas Tech, however, is pretty far developed for multiple decades. And, that's probably a large reason that the state of Texas, as well as its size, has as many collegiate recovery programs as it does. In California, similar thing with the size of the state, but also the UC system at what point, put a lot of resources and politics behind, those schools all having collegiate recovery programs, and that has an effect for other schools in the state. And then the other ones, the cluster of West Virginia, North Carolina, and Virginia that I mentioned, they all had state funding for collegiate recovery. So that's kind of one way I'll answer that question. The other piece of it is that most of our member schools are very large state schools. So we don't really see collegiate recovery programs as often at smaller institutions, at community colleges, at private institutions. And there's a variety of reasons behind that, I think. But when you look at some of the schools in Southeast Pennsylvania, they might kind of fit that bill, whether it's the structure of the school or there hasn't been the state politics and funding behind it specifically. So I think that's kind of even going back to the prior question, if you don't have the stories like the champion and then the politics and the funding kind of all working in tandem, it's hard to kind of get it off the ground.
Well, I just got an education, so that was really good to hear, Tim. And to be honest, and working with other folks, in Southeast Pennsylvania and in some schools in Philly too, and trying to establish collegiate recovery, I'm going to say something that's probably pretty controversial, but not so much. Some schools probably shouldn't have collegiate recovery programs because one, having infrastructure is absolutely key, being close to resources in case there's a reoccurrence of use, and also in terms of having other administrative support. That's another big thing. And I've been working with other schools who've had full administrative buy-in, but I always say this, you need students first. The reason you need students and a champion, like part of the reason why so many schools just kind of peter out or don't pick up on it is one, they've got money, they've got all the administrative support, but they don't know how to go out and reach students that are in recovery because one, the stigma is still so absolutely great that students don't want to come forward and disclose. The other part of it is that they, more often than not, if they move into a 4-year institution, they've already figured out their supports unless they're actually going to that school for collegiate recovery programs. And going back to another thing that I thought about too is it's hard for a student to be the first student or the first two students to really be anchored in a collegiate recovery program because God forbid, you don't want all the attention focused in on you. And then God forbid, if you have a reoccurrence or God forbid something happens, you don't get along with the staff, you don't get along with the administration or the other students. So it's a really hard and delicate balance. It's almost like making a souffle. You could do everything right, stick it in the oven, one shift here or there, the whole thing just falls flat and you're just like, what was all that for? So again, there's no recipe. It can't be franchised, so to speak. Each campus has its own culture that exists within its own community, which exists within its own region, and people choose schools for a lot of different reasons. And the best thing I always say is that my job, especially as ARHE rep, is just being an information broker, is helping other folks to be tied into other schools. But again, it's a tricky thing.
COVID, the coronavirus, and how has that started to reshape the way that collegiate recovery programs exist and engage with the student body, with faculty, with the leadership. And I would be curious as to, Keith, if you want to kick us off, what's happening in terms of that. We've heard pivot, we've heard, change, we've heard all those wonderful words. But at the end of the day, the continuity and the consistency is still very important for people who are seeking those supports and who otherwise would have sought out those supports in that campus environment. So Keith, any thoughts on what that looks like today? What's going well and maybe what's not?
Okay, I mean, honestly, it's funny how this is called Zoom, but we all sit down in front of a computer, so we come to a full stop at a Zoom. So there's a little bit of fatigue, definitely for students and people, everywhere. The thing that's not so unique is that we're all going through this pandemic in one degree or another, and it's impacted, everything that we do. And our students feel that. The students have had to pivot from seeing folks, seeing all of their connections at face-to-face to now moving, online and really limiting their contacts and the things that we do. Students have had to be creative, and students have had to really literally, this is the beautiful part of having solid recovery principles, is understanding that we're doing this one day at a time. And it has forced them to really reevaluate what's important, how to change how they study, who can they have in their lives and what can they have in their lives, and really understanding that they are part of a whole ecosystem, whereas before, they could exist maybe separate and apart from a lot of other things, but understanding that what they do impacts other folks. And they're talking about, wow, I'm in recovery. Now I have to be mindful of my friends, my family. And then now, how do I educate folks on, now that I'm sober, how do I have those conversations with people who didn't know that I started to get sober in college? Now I'm at home learning remotely. What does that mean? How do I deal with a family that may be chaotic or dysfunctional? How do I reach out for services? And thankfully, therapists and other folks have been able to adjust, and we've been doing things through telehealth, but it hasn't been ideal, but it's something, I'll go back to the idea of us being adaptable, and this is where we're at. And my concern is that, it's going to take a minute for us to really bounce back from the experience of COVID. Not even if we don't have it, but there's still collateral. There's still stuff. This whole collective experience is going to leave an impression and a mark, probably unlike anything we've ever seen in our natural lives. So, but to a lot of my students' credit, they haven't found it necessary to use a problematic substance in this time. And to me, that's a miracle. That is an absolute miracle. At times of high stress, they've opted to remain, vigilant about their recovery and aware of what could trip them up. So I give them lots of credit, and I'm very grateful for it.
Tim, any thoughts from you on COVID and how that is changing the way that anyone, or students or anyone, are seeking supports, maintaining their recovery?
Yeah, I mean, admittedly, I'll never have as much of an institutional, in-depth experience or knowledge of the folks on the ground doing the actual work. If COVID wasn't around, I do get to visit probably more campuses and staff in person more than anyone else, and I'm fortunate of that. And in the absence of that, there's been a lot of conversations with staff and students that I've had. So for me, it kind of boils down to these, this like three-part piece. One, I think because of all this, the collective morale of not just the collegiate recovery field, but from what I've seen, the collective morale has just plummeted, and I don't think it's hit its bottom. So the morale just keeps going down, right? And then things that have had to happen, in terms of these pivots, aren't necessarily helping. For students, for example, online learning, or if they're in a foreign country and they're having to now tune in at 1 a.m. or something for a lecture, like things that they've had to pivot to are not exactly helping that. And then on the inverse of that, things that would generally be beneficial to help pull them out of that, they're not able to do. A lot of that being like in-person, socializing and community building and just fun activities. And I saw some tweet that was essentially like, I'm looking forward to one day being able to read a book peacefully at night again and not scrolling through doomsday of Twitter, something like that. And so I think that's a very real reality as well, is that the options now aren't very helpful. And then the third piece of kind of who we are, we're not a huge organization, right? So we don't necessarily have the bandwidth or the resources to provide staff, programs, students with what they really probably do need to help pull them out of that kind of collective morale decline. And so we're doing the best we can, with, a lot of weekly offerings for free, in terms of webinars and, outlets for staff to chat and recovery meetings and book clubs and, little things here and there, events, stuff like that. But, is it the same? No. Is it helping? I think so. We get great feedback and everything, but yeah, I mean, like Keith described and what a lot of other folks describe, it's tough. It's a very big uphill battle for a lot of folks.
Yeah, it's kind of like, this is just a moment of triage. Like, it's just really just holding status quo for as long as we can possibly do it. And I'll say this, and this is one thing that's really been interesting to me. Now students can go and have meetings all over the world. Like, they're not limited. If there was one student I was talking to, they're like, I can't go to sleep. I'm like, go to a meeting. They're like, what are you talking about? I'm like, go to London and get on and go to a meeting and see how they're doing it overseas. And that would be something that I would normally say, like, if you're going on a trip, if you find a 12-step, just go and see what it's like so that you know that it's kind of uniform. Quick dumb story. I had a friend, he's still my friend. In 7th grade, he went to like Switzerland or something, right? And he went to Switzerland or somewhere in England. He was just like, I wanted to go to McDonald's. I'm like, why would you want to go to McDonald's? He goes, because I know what I was getting. It's comforting. It's so American. So when I talk to students, I'm like, if you go to a different place, try and find a 12-step meeting. So you can find that your condition, you're not alone, and that your condition is not so different than a lot of other folks. So one of the best parts about COVID, if there can be a best part, is that there are options that people didn't even think to consider before, which is traveling the world from your room.
I feel personally attacked. I've totally gone to McDonald's with my sponsor in foreign countries.
This podcast was created and will always maintain the integrity and talking about the stigma of addiction. And I want to make sure that you both have a chance to comment on this. Given the fact that, we are maybe not in the height of the opioid crisis, but we certainly are still seeing, the tremendous ramifications of that, plus, ongoing issues of addiction, social injustice. How do you feel about stigma today versus maybe how you felt about stigma 5 years ago or 3 years ago? It doesn't have to be 5 years ago if we need to be a little more current.
For me at least, maybe a little bit of like an unconventional response to it. But, 5 years ago, I think I looked at stigma as not inconsequential, but it was just, I think I was blinded by how privileged I really was because it didn't prevent me from a lot. And I'm blessed to like work in this field, and I do check off, an incredible amount of privileged boxes. And then to see what so many others have had to deal with, I think what I look at it as now is so much more in line with discrimination rather than stigma. It's almost like stigma just doesn't really encapsulate what actually happens for so many individuals. I think kind of, addiction and drug use overall, might have that like cloud around it. But what actually happens to individuals, I think, is a lot more serious. And, if we're talking more around kind of like awareness and like that kind of level of it, which, when I hear stigma, I always think of, like more like awareness of, recovery and stories and what that kind of looks like. And, I had the opportunity to intern at the Obama White House in their recovery branch in their Office of Drug Control Policy. And there was these, the director at the time was Michael Botticelli, who's in recovery. And he had these two quotes that he would share that I thought, really captured what we can collectively do when, we're sharing about recovery and sharing about our stories and, kind of getting that out there in the right places in the right ways. I think there's emphasis on that. But, one quote was really short. It was just, "It's hard to hate up close." And I think that was really powerful because, he would share about individuals that, did not look positively upon individuals who used drugs or individuals who were in recovery and had no understanding of what it really meant. And, until a friend or a family member almost kind of like came out or opened up to them about their use, all of a sudden that perception totally changed. And the other quote I think was actually from, a speech that President Obama gave maybe at the DNC a while back was, your voice can change a room. And if it can change a room, it can change a community. If it can change a community, it can change a city. Then it can change a state. It can change a country. How important it was to speak up and, advocate for issues that are important, or, to vote, or, in this case, to, speak about your own journey, whether it's lived experience in recovery or, a parent of loss or anything like that. And, so for me, that's kind of what I, come back to a bit, but it's, like you kind of mentioned and alluded to, it's a pretty complex kind of topic to dissect.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tim. And again, I'm of the same mind. Stigma is too small of a word, because the way I look at it, honestly, is this is life or death. And and very similar to Tim, like, I don't care about who knows that I'm in recovery. It's just whatever. It's like, I'll just talk about it, but it's not a thing for me. What's sad for me is when I deal with a student who's got everything in the world going for them, and they're going into a certain profession, and mind you, they're smart, honestly, pretty smart, affable young people who feel like they can't even be out about their recovery. They can't even say, because they're going into business, or they're being an attorney, or they're going to be a doctor or something like that, some type of profession, that they can't even talk about being in recovery because the stigma or the perception is so great. And it's so amazing, even in the medical field. But it's the idea of someone who is in recovery somehow defective, is that there's something absolutely wrong to them, or that they're just walking liability. Whereas if you look at them in their lives, really they're on the other end of the health continuum, but it's still that idea that, well, we know what could cause this person to quote unquote fall or do whatever.
You both have been, this has been an incredibly thought-provoking and informative and insightful conversation. And I want to thank you both for your willingness to be so candid with us, and your willingness to be so direct and honest.
Sure.
Yeah, this is fun. This is great. Thank you.
If you or someone you know is suffering from opioid addiction, please visit ibxfoundation.org/SYK. The link is in our show notes below.